I was born in India. I grew up elsewhere also, but I've been a professor at the New School for a number of years, and I'm a development economist. I'm planning to really ask the question, which is as much a question I'm asking myself as hoping to address to the audience, of where we started from, or how is it that we should understand the past and how inequalities came to be formed in the past. First. Second, what is the current moment in terms of the creation of inequalities or the cementing of the inequalities that already exist? How should we understand what's taking place today? And finally, how should we make sense of the possible futures of the entire world in terms of the evolution of inequality? What are some of the scenarios that we could imagine? And what's going to make the difference as to which scenario emerges and which does not? And what is the role of our collective efforts to bring about one of those futures as opposed to another? So that's going to be the broad agenda. It's very, very grand. I am going to be talking about global inequalities, but in that connection, I will also discuss some of the inequalities within countries. Also to understanding a little bit more up close through the discussions I might have the opportunity to have. What are some of the issues that are reverberating in people's minds? I certainly am well aware that inequality is absolutely at the center of the debate now in South Africa, more in some respects than it has been since the end of apartheid, at any other point since the end of apartheid. So I think it's a very interesting moment, and look forward to learning about what is happening in the country. Let me start by noting that I've set a very broad, indeed grand agenda, and I'm obviously not going to be able to address every question adequately. It might seem a mile wide and an inch thick, as they say, but if you'll forgive me, I think there are some advantages to taking a broad view of the issues that we have in front of us. The center's mandate is broad, so I feel somewhat encouraged in my own tendencies in this regard. Let me just begin by stating the obvious. One of my favorite thoughts of George Orwell, not in so many words, but almost these words. I think it's in his essay on the politics of the English language, or politics in the English language. It might be somewhere else, is that there's often no more political act than to state the obvious. So let's start by stating the obvious, which is that we live in a very unequal world. And obviously you live in a very unequal country. We all live in very unequal countries. South Africa has often been thought of as, and according to measures of inequality, has been found to be the most unequal country in the world. Now, such measures should be taken with a very large dollop, not just a pinch of salt. There are lots of reasons for doubting the accuracy of the data we have. And one of those reasons, which I will come back to throughout this lecture, is that we don't have a very good way of measuring what is happening at the very top end of the distribution of income and of wealth. And that's, of course, the reason why a lot of effort has gone into that quite recently. There's some famous inequality researchers whose work has centered on that. Thomas Piketty and his collaborators, for example. But they're not the only ones. That has been an area of active research because household surveys, which we've relied on historically, are very bad at measuring the very top end. An obvious reason for that is that it's quite unlikely that the very richest are going to be chosen in a household survey, but even more unlikely that they're going to answer the door when the surveyor comes to call and answer all of the surveyor's questions truthfully. So there is need to supplement the data from those traditional sources. The world as a whole, it turns out, if one uses some of the same measures of interpersonal inequality, for example, the Gini coefficient is applied to household surveys, that's the most well-known measure, which many of you will be familiar with, has a similar level of inequality to South Africa. There are some debates about exactly what level and whether it's been going up or going down a little bit, but let's say roughly around 0.65, which is a very, very high level of inequality indeed. Now, why has it been falling slightly? There are some well-known reasons for that. First of all, as Branko and others have pointed out, the biggest contributor to interpersonal inequality in the world, that is to say, inequality is measured between every individual in the world, treating them as a single pool, is between country inequality. And the smaller contributor is within country inequality. Now, what has been happening to between country inequality? Well, as you all know, there are some countries in the world, a couple of very large countries, in particular in Asia, namely China and more recently India, that have been growing quite quickly. China's growth rate has slowed, but for a period of quite considerable period of 3.5 decades, it had an enormously high growth rate of per capita income. And for that reason, the relative gap between the incomes of the richest people in the world and some of the poorer people in the world, in particular in these large countries, has been falling. The relative gap, that is to say, if you take the ratio between their incomes, you would find that that ratio of per capita incomes of countries has been falling. But of course, if one is to measure inequality in the entire world, one can't simply look at a pair of countries such as the United States and China, for example, where that relative gap has been falling because Chinese growth rates have been, over a period of time, been much higher than US growth rates of per capita income. One has to look at all the pairs that there are, which is one way to interpret what the Gini coefficient is, that it's a measure of the average gap that exists between all of the different pairs. Now, if you look at that measure, what would you find? Or look at the measure in that way, what would you find? In that larger, more comprehensive way. Well, of course, China has also been pulling away, and India more recently, from countries that are still poorer in the world. So on the one hand, there's a gap that's falling between the richest countries in the world and these fast-growing countries. On the other hand, there's a gap that's increasing between these fast-growing countries and still poorer countries, many of them in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So the relative ratio between the Chinese per capita income and some of the poorer countries in the world, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, not South Africa, but many poorer countries, has been increasing at the very same time that that gap between the richest and the fast-growing countries has been decreasing. So this is what's driving the measured slight decrease in world interpersonal inequality. A lot of effort has been put into this by researchers, but does it really matter? Perhaps we can return to this in the conversation afterwards, because I don't want to dwell on all of the philosophical issues that could be raised. There are a number of them. There are some who have argued that world inequality really shouldn't bother us. We should be only interested in inequality within countries, if we're interested in inequality at all. But I thought it would be helpful for you to know a little bit about what is happening to measured world inequality and what is driving that. It's still very high, mind you, even if it's fallen a little bit due to these changes. Now, what can we expect in the long run? Is everything, as they say, hunky-dory as a result of this change? No, not at all, because not only is the measure very high, but it's going to take a very, very, very long time for world inequalities to fall substantially, even with the rapid growth rates that have been observed. And of course, there are a lot of countries that are being left out, which have very, very modest growth rates of per capita income. So the growth process in the world would need to be much more inclusive, it would need to be much more rapid, and it would need to be much more sustained for there to be a substantial decrease in global interpersonal inequality. Now, what about the top end? Let's leave aside the surveys and all of these measures that have been done. Okay, I'm going to rely not on an academic source, but on a business magazine. This is the very first page of the latest Forbes report. And you won't be able to, I think, read this partly because it's out of focus, but it's also very small. So let me just tell you what this slide says. First of all, it notes that there are now more billionaires than ever. The number surprised me. 2,781 in all, worldwide, according to Forbes. 141 more than last year. That's a pretty rapid rate of production of billionaires. Just eyeballing it, I think roughly 5%. And 26 more than the record set in 2021. They're richer than ever, worth $14.2 trillion in aggregate, up by $2 trillion from 2023. Again, that's a pretty rapid rate of increase in their aggregate wealth. And $1.1 trillion above the previous record, also set in 2021. 2/3 of the list members are worth more than a year ago, only 1/4 are poorer. Most of the gains come from the top 20, who added a combined $700 billion in wealth since 2023. So there's a sort of a fractal process, as economists like to say, and mathematicians, taking place, which is that even among billionaires, there's a kind of inequality in the growth process, which is rewarding the richest billionaires more than those who are not quite as rich. The US now boasts a record 813 billionaires worth a combined $5.7 trillion. China remains second with 473, including Hong Kong, worth $1.7 trillion, despite weak consumer spending and a real estate bust that helped to wipe out some $300 billion in wealth. And India, which has $200 billion, also a record, 200 billionaires, also a record, ranks third. Okay. Now, I'm sorry that this is so out of focus. So again, I'll have to tell you what it says, but there's a real-time list, by the way, if this interests you. First thing in the morning after your cup of coffee, you can check the real-time list and see how the billionaires have moved up or down, if that's what excites you. Turns out that in the published results for 2024, the Bernard Arnault, who is a French billionaire who owns the LVMH luxury brands and company, and his family was rated to be the richest person in the world, along with his family wealth, I believe. But since then, if you look at the real-time list, you'll see that Elon Musk, who was number 2, has now moved up. So in the latest results that I checked yesterday, Elon Musk was number 1, and Bernard Arnault had fallen a bit. That's because this depends on stock market results, etc. Now you can see on the top right a graph of billionaires' wealth history, and you can see that that's the aggregate wealth of billionaires. There isn't a vertical axis there, but I mentioned some of the numbers to you, and it's been increasing rapidly over the last 5 years. But it's not just a 5-year process. This has been a multi-decade process, so we should really see ourselves as in an era of plutocratic wealth creation, right? A kind of gilded age, new gilded age, as some have called it, that has emerged since maybe around 1980. Now, if you look down this list, and sorry, again, it's out of focus, but you'll see that there are a number of people who are billionaires from the US tech sector. Jeff Bezos, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison, right? All of you, many of you will know their companies, of course. Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, etc. Further down, number 9 is Mukesh Ambani, the richest Indian billionaire. Now, happily, you can search this database and find the billionaires from each country in the world. And if you do that for South Africa, you find 6 billionaires, and they're pretty modest on the list in terms of their wealth relative to the global billionaires as a whole. The wealthiest South African billionaire is Johan Rupert and family, $12.2 billion, with their luxury goods empire, then Nicky Oppenheimer and family, etc. Now, it amused me that when I searched for the Indian billionaires, of whom, as we read, there were quite a few, turns out there are exactly the same number of Indian billionaires as there are with my last name, as there are South African billionaires. There are 6 Indian billionaires with the last name Reddy. Though it might comfort you to know that they're poorer than the South African billionaires. Nevertheless, there are 6 of them. Okay. Income and wealth shares globally. This is from the World Top Inequality, Top Income, database that Thomas Piketty and his collaborators have put together, and their World Inequality Report. So if this is too out of focus for you to read, don't worry, you can just go to their website and this will appear right at the top. And it shows the proportion of global income and the proportion, which is on the left, and the proportion of global wealth, which is on the right, which is possessed by various income fractiles or quantiles. And in particular, one can see what share the top 1% possess. Now, the top 1% is a very expansive category, of course, much more expansive than billionaires. It includes quite a number of people who are mere millionaires, right, and not billionaires. According to their results, the top 1% in the world possess 19% of global income and 38% of global wealth. So their proportion of global wealth is much larger than their proportion of global income. That's not surprising. It's also found in household survey data and so on, because most people don't possess much, if any, financial wealth. Stocks and bonds, for example. This tends to be the province of the relatively rich. And so if one calculates inequality in financial wealth, it's often very high, off the charts high. Okay. Now, what about by region? If you do a geographical breakdown of income groups, you'll find that the legacy sites of wealth, the developed countries, in particular what I will call Europe and its offshoots, which I'll return to in due course, specifically North America and Oceania, which means Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, most especially, and Europe, which is the blue area at the top, commands the largest percentage or largest share of those who are in the top 1% of the population. The top 1% of the population is on the far right of these two. The bottom one, these two charts, and the bottom 1% of the population is on the far left. So we can see that they still play a very substantial role in terms of global wealth. On the other hand, the wealth share of the emerging economies is rapidly increasing. Okay, and this is, of course, another manifestation of the growth process that I was referring to, especially in China, but also in India and elsewhere in the world. The wealth share of the emerging economies has risen from 16.43% of world wealth in 2008 to 29.26% in 2023, and the World Inequality Report, excuse me, this isn't the World Inequality Report, this is UBS, another bank, building on data from UNU Wider, the World Institute for Development Economics Research. They estimate or guesstimate that it's going to go up to roughly a third by 2028. Okay. Now, why does this matter? Again, let me be a little bit more specific. I think one way to think about this is in terms of what Amartya Sen calls capabilities, by which he means what people can actually achieve in their lives, what can they actually do. You know, we may not be bothered that somebody has a lot of money and another person has not very much money in the bank, or that one person has a very high income and another person has a very low income, except that it translates into things that do matter. It translates into the abilities of people to actually pursue certain ends in their lives, right? It might also translate not only into their ability individually to do things that depend in part on the resources that they can command and deploy in the market, but it may also be the case that the relations between people are shaped in some way by those inequalities, and maybe there are forms of domination which enter into the relations between people because of the stark inequalities that there are. I find this a very productive way to think about why inequalities matter. Even though most people who've used
Amartya Sen's capability framework have tended to employ it to look at the absolute living standards of people and how they can be better understood. I think there's also a very valuable role that framework plays in understanding inequality. And indeed, one of Amartya Sen's first books on the subject, one of his less well-read and well-known books, was a book called Inequality Re-Examined, which he wrote in the early 1990s. Let me be a little bit more specific in describing the issues involved. We live in a world where there are not just stark inequalities, but extreme absolute deprivations. Right? People who lack in the basics of the beings and doings that Amartya Sen refers to, the elementary capabilities. And it's the presence of those two things together, I would suggest, that makes the stark inequalities that we have particularly bothersome. Because it's not a great stretch to suggest that there are things that could be done which would not harm the billionaires a great deal, that would potentially reduce those disadvantages, those absolute disadvantages. Again, I will return to this theme toward the end of my remarks. Similarly, let us think about inequality and democracy. We know that the rich do seek to influence policy, and sometimes toward ends which involve wealth preservation and extension. Right? There's a lovely book, very good book by a sociologist named Jeffrey Winters, which is on oligarchy. And that's the title of the book, Oligarchy. And his thesis is that the central defining feature of oligarchy is a desire for wealth preservation. And on this criterion, he classifies the United States also as being an oligarchy in which the wealth effectively deploy their political power toward the end of wealth preservation and, of course, extension. So to the extent that dollars, so to speak, or rand, or whatever it may be, rupees, translate into the ability to influence the public sphere through political contributions, through financing of think tanks and shaping the public discourse, and so on and so forth, and maybe simply through certain forms of social deference which arise from the possession of wealth, that would tend to corrupt the functioning of democracies and enable certain forms of domination in public life. And this, of course, suggests to us that the corrective need not only be to reduce the inequalities, but to reduce the ways to change or to diminish the ways in which these inequalities translate into those forms of domination in social and political life. Again, I shall return to that question. Okay, so where do the inequalities in the world come from? I promised in my abstract to talk about this, so let me just attempt to do that a little bit. Well, I think part of what's so difficult about understanding contemporary inequalities is that they come from multiple overlapping sources. If you look at that list of billionaires, you'll see that they're in all sorts of sectors, and those sectors vary from country to country. In South Africa, the billionaires are still very much associated with mining and resource extraction, though not only. Right? In the United States, the new billionaires are very much coming out of the tech sector, and the largest, as well as finance, right? And so on and so forth. So there are variations. In India, you have both. In China, many of them are connected to manufacturing. And of course, China has been a manufacturing exporting power, so that's not a surprise. So there are multiple processes that are involved today, and there have also been multiple processes involved historically, and wealth today is linked to historical sources of wealth as well, right? Now, if you look up if you examine, go into the history of the richest historical families, you'll find that some of them would seem to have all but disappeared. The German family known as the Fuggers, for example. If you ask the question, they were fabulously wealthy families, sometimes thought of as having been the wealthiest family that ever lived. There's some indications of that a few hundred years ago. Their descendants are a little hard to identify. There's some minor German and European aristocrats who appear to be the descendants of the Fuggers, right? So some of these historical sources of wealth dissipate in some fashion, but they may also be quite present in ways that we don't fully appreciate. Now, to state the obvious, in South Africa, I don't need to tell you this, you all know this in your bones, right? A lot of the wealth that exists is based upon the appropriation of nature, which of course also has associated with it the exclusion of those who might previously have, if there were inhabitants, as there were in South Africa, previously have benefited and had a relationship to land and to nature. Real estate, agriculture, forestry, mining, and resource extraction generally are closely connected with these historical processes. And some of these appropriation processes are still ongoing, not only in terms of the appropriation of land, as many scholars have pointed out, but also in other forms, such as fire sale privatizations, which have happened in many countries, effectively transfers of public wealth to the private sector, often in a form that's a little bit obscure or occluded, not entirely visible to public view. Right? But alongside those forms of appropriation, which Marx referred to as primitive accumulation, right, and others today have referred to using such phrases as accumulation by dispossession, we do have other things going on. I've mentioned them: manufacturing wealth, finance. There are various circuits of capital which are involved in transforming wealth from one form to another and deploying wealth in ways which allows additional wealth to be extracted. Intellectual property rights are another domain in which new kinds of claims are being created, and where there's much more of a claim being made today than had been made historically, arguably. The tech sector is able to generate the enormous returns that it is, very, very much centered in the United States, because in part of globalization. There are what are called network externalities that are involved. It's very difficult not to participate in certain networks once a large proportion of other people participate in them. Right? The cost to not participating goes up, the benefits of participating go up as well. So there's a crowding in effect which is generated. Right. Now, of course, there are scholars who would point to the role of savings, thrifty behavior, and other virtuous behavior in generating wealth. And I don't want to exclude that, because certainly there are differences in savings rates between societies, for instance, and between people. You know, East Asia has long had very, very high savings rates, and it's not fully understood why it does. There may be some cultural reasons, and there are certainly institutional reasons. And that has probably contributed a great deal to East Asian development. And many other countries that are seeking to develop seek to also encourage savings on an aggregate level. This is not an exhaustive list, but I want to simply point to the idea that there are multiple different layered phenomena from the past and the present which are involved. There's a sort of a palimpsest, many different layers from the past. If you think about visiting, I don't know if any of you have visited Rome, but that would be an example of such a place where there are many different layers built upon one another, both historical and present. And I think that's what we experience when we look at contemporary wealth. Okay? And the historical legacies and the contemporary dynamics interact. And this is the element of truth in the idea that the rich get richer. I tend to resist the axiom that the rich get richer. I don't think it's true. But I think there is some evidence of the rich getting richer in what we might call the neoliberal era of the last decades, quite a bit of evidence. And this is visible not only in the macro statistics, but also in microeconomic phenomena, such as, for instance, that when one looks at measured rates of return from different kinds of investment, the rates of return for certain forms of investment that are only accessible to the rich have been much higher than the rates of return to the kinds of investment that ordinary people tend to make. Right. So private equity, hedge funds, for example, and other such categories, certain kinds of non-standard assets, luxury assets, forests, other such things, some exotic assets. A number of these are assets that rich people have invested in and have had very high rates of return, but ordinary people would have a very hard time investing in them, middle-class people, even if they had deployable resources. So they're path-dependent histories. Each country has its own historical legacies. But the pattern of inequality in the world reflects the combined effects of these different processes and circuits, so to speak. Crucially, globalization has enabled these processes to operate on a much wider scale in a much more interactive way and to be much more remunerative, especially when paired with pro-private property and deregulatory policies of various kinds. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with a phrase that's attributed to the French novelist Balzac. And there's some question as to what exactly he said. So I attempted some research, but roughly speaking, the English translation of his of the French sentence that is attributed to him is that the secret of great fortunes without an apparent source is a crime that has been forgotten because it was properly executed. Right? Now, as I have noted, some fortunes are obscure in terms of their background, but not all fortunes are. We can identify the proximate historical sources of some of the ill-gotten wealth that exists in the world, ill-gotten or not. But even so, it's not always obvious what to do about it. And there are lots of reasons for this. There are moral reasons, there are practical reasons. There may be an accretion of expectations over time. There may be contracts of various kinds that are formed in society. Right? And this is, of course, a point that some of the libertarians and others tend to emphasize. Robert Nozick, the great libertarian philosopher who is a defender of wealth, argued that one shouldn't look too far back into the history of wealth because it would upend everything. And that whatever rectification of prior crimes and appropriations was undertaken should have a statute of limitations. But I would not emphasize that. Let me point to something else which I think is pertinent, which is that there are present-day consequences of redistributions. And at the least, redistributions may require complementary productivity-oriented policies. You're all familiar with, of course, the debate in Zimbabwe, and there's a corresponding debate in South Africa about land and its redistribution. And I think it's fair to say, and I'm glad to be corrected, but there was a precipitous drop in output that was associated with some of the land redistribution that took place in Zimbabwe, at least initially, because of the lack of complementary policies that would enable productive use of the land that had been transferred. So that would be the kind of issue that one would need to pay attention to in addressing such redistribution. Okay. Now, taking a bit more of a conceptual view of the problem from a wider perspective, many economists tend to argue, and certainly this is a very dominant idea in economic policy, the main thing that we ought to focus on as economists or as policymakers is maximizing wealth. Because after all, once we have maximized the wealth, we can redistribute it. And the premise seems to be we can redistribute it in whatever way we wish afterwards. This is an idea that's made very explicit in some of the economic models that students learn. For example, in international trade theory, but also in other areas where the focus is entirely on maximizing national wealth through the right policies so as to then subsequently be able, it is imagined, to redistribute that wealth in whatever way one wishes. Of course, it's not always straightforward to redistribute wealth or income. I'm focusing on economic inequalities here, though the dean rightly pointed to the interaction of different kinds of inequalities, intersectional nature of certain inequalities, and we can return to that. You would have noticed that all the billionaires on the list that I showed you earlier were men. There are women in the list, but they're relatively few, and they're mostly women who inherited their wealth. Okay. So I think a more realistic way of thinking about distribution is that the productive process, production itself, gives rise to inequalities in any particular empirical context. The kind of inequalities it gives rise to depend, of course, on the specificities of ownership, who owns what by way of capital and labor, for instance, and labor with different kinds of skill, for example, but also are a consequence of the kind of incentive regime which is in place. How different factors of production, so to speak, are rewarded or not for their contributions to the production process. So one has to get into the thick and messy business of how institutions operate. What are the laws? What are the norms? What are the initial conditions of possession of various assets in order to understand the particular inequalities to which production gives rise? But production does give rise to inequalities, in particular in a market context. And inequalities also in turn affect production. And there are lots of reasons why that's so. And one of the things that economists have elaborated in this regard is that when people don't have enough to have collateral adequate to be able to borrow, for instance, then that makes them constrained in terms of investing in themselves or making other kinds of investments which would be potentially productive for them. So relaxing their wealth constraint might be quite beneficial, not just for those individuals, but for the economy by enabling a higher level of output to emerge. Similarly with liquidity constraints, what people have in hand to deploy. Contracting and informational difficulties related to ownership and the boundaries of the firm and so on, all sorts of issues which I won't go into. But it's quite clear that the pattern of who owns what can also have an effect on production in real conditions outside of the la-la land where none of these problems exist. And in that la-la land, of course, which some of you as students might have encountered, general equilibrium theory, for instance, in economics, production is interpreted as a one-time process. There are endowments and then there are outcomes. But in reality, we live in time, a process of time where every after, so to speak, becomes a beginning of the next moment in the process of production. So we really can't take this kind of an abstract view meaningfully. So outside of the extreme cases, it would seem that there is scope within any system of production to shape the distribution that results by influencing norms, laws, and so forth. Of course, tax and transfer, which works on the market incomes which are realized, but also those policies that influence the market incomes themselves. So the question is really how much opportunity do we have to shape those outcomes within any given market context? One way that I might suggest that we think about this is that economic policy ought to focus on the area of overlap between output and distributional goals, by which I mean those things that can improve productivity and enhance output, but also at the same time help to reduce inequalities and deprivations, of course. So if we look at the debates that take place in the world, it seems to me that we can characterize the left-wing and the right-wing points of view, so to speak, on this in the following way. The left, so to speak, has tended to see no conflict between output and distributional goals, at least if we take a caricatural view of an extreme left position, in which distributional goals can be pursued without considering at all their effect on output. For instance, the idea that you can tax incomes as much as you like without affecting incentives and affecting output. That would be one extreme end of the spectrum in this debate. And on the other end, the right, so to speak, has tended to see a harsh conflict between the two, so that distributional goals are pursued at great peril to output, and potentially, therefore, it is suggested to the common good. Right? I'm sure you've all encountered these extreme or caricatural views. And my suggestion to you is that in the middle between these two extremes, there's an enormous range of possibilities, right? But to understand what is the scope for pursuing our distributional goals of reducing stark inequalities in particular and extreme deprivations, while enhancing output, requires a great deal of attention to the details of what it is that's constraining output, for example. What are the kinds of investment in people or wealth expansion, which could really enable them to enjoy increased productivity and output, both individually and also thereby to contribute to social productivity. I was talking with your dean earlier about the financing system for higher education in South Africa and some of the difficulties that students have in financing their educations. And this seems to me to be a very important example of where there may be scope for such interventions by enabling students who have such difficulties to have easier access to credit, for example, on favorable terms, and maybe making the repayment of loans income contingent, as has been done in certain countries, so that those who realize lower incomes pay back only a portion of their loans, and so forth. There are many creative policies that could be imagined and which have been imagined and which could be employed, which make a great deal of sense because they're at this intersection. Right. So how much of a conflict there is in any given situation is an empirical question, and it depends on the specificities of economic incentives, how property rights shape access to liquidity and credit, information flows, economies of scale, for example. That's been a big issue in land reform in Zimbabwe and elsewhere, whether there are economies of scale or not, which make it make sense to have larger plots of land, or to have smallholders who receive land find ways to aggregate so as to realize those economies of scale, if that's possible. Okay. Now, I don't have a great deal of time. I think I'd like to finish with, at least as I understand it, we can run only till 6. So let me try to rush through what I have remaining to say in the next 7 minutes or so. Economists who work on growth and development, of course, have identified many of the factors that have an influence on output and on inequality, but they usually don't look at these together, as I have been suggesting that we should, that we really need to understand the matrix, so to speak, of causal factors in which output is generated as being simultaneous with that in which inequalities are generated, because they're really one and the same process in the societies and in the economies in which we live. So typically economists have spoken of endowments, the role of capital, for example, whether countries have a great deal of capital or not. Rich countries have been characterized as having a lot of capital relative to labor, poor countries as not having much capital relative to labor. So what are those endowments? What is to begin with, capital, skilled labor, etc. What is the role of geography? Beginning with Adam Smith, who emphasized the role of access to rivers and waterways in growth and development. That's been a preoccupation of economists. Jeffrey Sachs has recently elaborated the view that geography is what matters. Technology, how transformable is technology? Institutions, by which economists generally mean, of course, everything. The laws, the norms, the functioning of the state, how well it functions to do certain things or not, and so on. Norms and culture. Inequality is also shaped by all of these things, but it's also shaped by who did what first. Who were for example, who came first and who came late to the growth process, as I will elaborate in a second. And crucially, the role of force. Right? Gramsci, of course, spoke of force and consent as being the crucial factors in society. But certainly the role of force, both across societies and within societies, in generating the inequalities that exist, has been considerable. Now, if you go back to the period before settled agriculture, prior to the Neolithic era, then on most accounts you find relatively egalitarian societies in class terms. But of course there's a big debate among anthropologists about this, because those societies were not necessarily equal in gender terms, and they were not necessarily equal in terms of age hierarchies and other such dimensions. But certainly the emergence of class, and in particular of wealth as a stored quantity which is intergenerationally transferred, seems broadly to be associated with settlement. But if you look at the vast sweep of history from that period, the onset of settled cultivation, 10,000 BC, let us say, though there's some debate about that, to the present, although there's a great deal of wealth concentration which is associated with what we might call the ebb and flow of empires, and some of that's still visible to us today in very tangible form, palaces, jewels, and so forth, and which are quite extraordinary to behold and which we go to museums to see. At the same time, it looks as if permanent inequalities between societies were not a central feature of that regime, for the most part. The crucial factor in generating permanent, or at least semi-permanent, it would seem, persistent, that would be a better word, persistent inequalities between societies, is what we might call the takeoff of Europe and its offshoots. This chart is from the data that Angus Maddison, who was a statistician and economist concerned with historical statistics, developed. And you'll see that for most of history, this is on the left is 1 AD, 500, 1000, 1500 AD. For most of history, according to his data, and there are some questions about it, there was really not much increase in global average GDP. So global average GDP took off roughly after 1800, right? And where did it take off? It took off in the West to start with, right? So Europe and its offshoots had the advantages of forwardness, to coin a term. Alexander Gerschenkron, the development economist and economic historian, spoke of the advantages of backwardness that some latecomers to development had, but these are the advantages of forwardness. They started early, and modern economic growth coincided with European global dominance, where force was, of course, a crucial factor. But there was also a cumulative causation of various aspects, technology and institutions. A lot of the great scientific discoveries happened in Europe. A lot of the great innovations, such as the joint stock company, which allowed people to buy shares and concentrate capital for investment purposes. But do you know what the first joint stock companies in the world were? The great exploring, so to speak, colonial and imperial companies. The Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. These were the first joint stock companies in the world. So that fundamental innovation in commerce and an economic organization which has underpinned so much of the development of capitalism was also deeply interconnected with colonialism and imperialism. And this is an example of why the inference problem is so great. It's so difficult to sort out. What are the causal contributors to contemporary inequalities that we can view in an innocent fashion, so to speak, and those which we must view as in some way soaked in crimes and in blood? I think that inference problem is quite deep, and it's not really owned up to adequately in the debate, where on the liberal end of the spectrum, people will say the West diverged from the rest because it had good institutions. It discovered early the importance of, for example, property rights and their protection, as well as institutions such as the joint stock company. It deployed the scientific method to great effect in developing new technologies and so on and so forth. But there's also this other side, and the historical coincidence of these two factors of Western dominance and these innovations make it a very difficult inference problem indeed. Again, I don't need to tell you there are lasting legacies in this country and in others, where the elites and ownership concentration is very closely related to that history. But newer disruptions to this pattern, in particular through the rise of Asia, but also other parts of the world. Part two of the drama, the last decades, the effects of which I've been talking about, of course, throughout these remarks, is the neoliberal era. roughly 1975 or 1980 to the present. I think crucially what has to be kept in mind is just as the last phase was soaked in politics, so to speak, politics and power, this phase is also in a way that we don't always adequately acknowledge. Recently there have been, of course, a lot of studies of neoliberalism and its history. Historians in particular, going into the archives and trying to tell that story. But it's on the surface, I think, for us to see that it was a very intentional project and therefore also a political project. Capitalism was in some way, if I may anthropomorphize, chomping at the bit to escape its nation-state container. And there was a conscious effort to develop an institutional arrangement for the world economy that could enable a fuller development of capitalism. And one example of that is the development of the World Trade Organization, proceeded, of course, through multiple rounds of negotiations in the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which preceded the World Trade Organization. Very intentional effort involving high-level political sponsorship, work by economists to present the intellectual framework and ideological framework for it. The World Intellectual Property Organization, of course, was a counterpart to the World Trade Organization, which gave importance to and a new way to think to define and protect so-called intellectual property rights. And of course, within nation states, you also had financialization, privatization, deregulation, brought about by the revolutions of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and copied elsewhere in the world, partly through IMF, World Bank aegis in the era of structural adjustment. This had, as we all know, substantial output and inequality effects because of the possibility of exploiting global economies of scale as well as of restructuring production and supply chains to bring about lower costs. The world we live in is comprehensively defined by that restructuring. One other contribution one might make to this analysis is to bring in the idea that Arthur Lewis, the great economist from the Caribbean, made development economists familiar with, which is known as the Lewis curve, Lewisian labor supply curve, which refers to the idea of there being an enormous amount of labor available on tap, so to speak, in the poorer countries in the world. And Lewis put that at the center of his description of the development of the nation state. But I think we could also and should also put that at the center of our description of the economic development of the world in the era of globalization, that China developed in part because of its enormous Lewisian labor supply, which was available on tap at very low wages without those wages having to increase very much until quite recently. In China, there's a debate on when that inflection point was and wages started to rise for the first time. And some people argue somewhere around 2010 to 2015. But in this world made safe for capital, so to speak, it was very crucial to find those sites of exploitable labor where the Lewisian labor supply curve could be made effectively usable. And that benefited certain countries a great deal. Whether labor supply would still be an advantage to the same extent anymore is, of course, a question due to the automation that is taking place. But one of Lewis's observations, which is very interesting and insightful in his original article on this, is that the exploitation of that labor supply curve would have as its counterpart a boom in profits. And I think that is very insightful and interesting in thinking about the era of globalization where there has been a boom in profits as well. Okay, so where are we now? There's an emerging debate, I think, as the pendulum has shifted a little bit from right to left due to some of the reactions to the extreme and stark inequalities we've faced, with new policy proposals being put on the agenda, being discussed, and to some extent even being achieved. One of the most interesting examples of late, as many of you know, is the agreement within the G20, which is now also being pursued in a broader framework within the United Nations, for a global minimum corporate tax. It's an extraordinary achievement. rather surprising, probably driven by some self-interested concerns on the part of the larger countries that felt they were losing tax revenues due to corporate entities shifting their headquarters to favorable jurisdictions such as Ireland, for example, with very low corporate tax rates. But whatever the reasons, partly because perhaps it plays well in this moment, the general public appreciates the idea of a minimum corporate income tax, corporate tax, but also for these self-interested reasons, it has actually emerged. And I think this is an example of a larger family of proposals that we ought to focus on, again in the spirit of looking for the area of overlap. National policies enabled by global coordination. One of the reasons that countries lowered their tax rates, deregulated and so on as rapidly as they did was that there was a race to the bottom to provide the most favorable conditions for corporate enterprises and for foreign investment in particular, but also to keep domestic investors at home. A coordinated approach to relevant policies should seek to reverse this race to the bottom. And I think the global minimum corporate tax is an example of that. There's also a discussion of re-regulation, of course, very tentative, but there are a lot of interesting proposals concerning re-regulation, some of which also gained some traction after the 2008 global financial crisis, of course, with respect to finance. And tech industries, where there is, especially in the US, but also in Europe, I should say, especially in Europe, but also in the US, a lot of focus on bringing competition policy and antitrust policy to bear on effectively the what are large monopolies in the tech industry, in part because of the network externalities that I mentioned. And a growing interest in the creation of what we might think of as public options, public platforms or their equivalent, which can provide an alternative. I think if we pursue this thinking about the area of overlap, then we might think about using the resources gained to reinvest in public goods, which have suffered severe neglect, and the social basis of economic productivity generally, which involves crucially investing in people, but also investing in the infrastructure that enables them to become effective market actors. I think the Swedish example is very interesting because even in the heyday of Swedish social democracy, when Sweden was a country that had, broadly speaking, social democratic policies in place that provided a very robust welfare state, and it was in many ways an example to those who sought those kinds of protections for people and investments in people. Sweden was still a highly unequal society, it turns out, in terms of wealth. The Swedish stock market was disproportionately owned by a few families, such as the famous Wallenberg family, but they were also heavily taxed. So I think this was a very interesting moment, at least, in which the existence of inequalities in wealth didn't necessarily translate, at least not directly, into inequalities in the social and political order and into outcomes. But of course, Sweden also has experienced some of the, so to speak, counter-revolution from the right that other countries have experienced with a rollback of those policies. So I'm not suggesting it as an instance or an example that doesn't have a cautionary element to it. It certainly does as well. But I would point to the importance of ensuring that wealth does not corrupt the polity and that its effects are kept in check. Right? And this, of course, requires a robust political project. It will generate counter-reactions of various kinds. Now, I think we're really running out of time for discussion, so let me just say, I'd like us to be a little bit cautious. I think one should be a bit cautious about one-time transfers, because one-time transfers however appealing they may be, do not provide people with the basis of becoming productive market actors that is so important for ensuring that they have a sustainable claim to income. And I think there are very strong political economy reasons why giving them that sustainable claim, empowering them as market actors, is much more likely to be successful in the long run. China, is an interesting example. That large white circle there is refers to China. This is a graph of income inequality in the world. And China is in that particular position because it had one of the steepest increases in income inequality, within country income inequality in the world, despite having very egalitarian initial conditions, so to speak, in 1980, due to the revolution of 1949. So those egalitarian initial conditions did not translate into egalitarian outcomes in the long run, due to the effect of very unequal development, patterns of development in China. Okay. So I won't elaborate on that. We can discuss it in the subsequent period, but let me just note that this is really an appeal for politics to be realistic by looking for the area of overlap between economic progress and inclusivity and designing policies appropriately. There is no inclusive economics without supportive politics. But I think in today's era that political action must be global and not only national to have a hope of full success. Okay. One way we might think about this, and I'm sure there are others, is that what we ought to adopt is a sort of a radical realism. We should be radical in our aims, but we should also be realistic in our understandings of what is possible and what to push for now. Okay. So I'm going to borrow a phrase from Winston Churchill. I'm sure he wouldn't agree with my use of it, but we're at the end of the beginning, and there's much more to be said and to be done. Thank you very much.